these countries have in common? Well, all of these countries had a substantially bigger economy than China did just 40 years ago. That might seem like a crazy statement today, especially considering that China has been the investing and economic darling of the world over the last several decades. But something happened recently that brought China's economy to a standstill: the coronavirus. The outbreak of this disease has slowed down the manufacturing hub of the world to the point where many other countries are seeing drug, food, and retail shortages. And what's interesting is that this is a problem that is unique to China, because if this outbreak were to have occurred in any other country, we would not have seen a global impact on the scale anywhere that we are seeing today. And here's why. During the thick of the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s, European and North American countries were going through a technological and economic boom. But what most people do not know is that during this time, China had by far the largest and most powerful economy in the world. In fact, China's economy was larger than all European and North American countries combined. Now, this was for a few key reasons. One of which was that in previous centuries, China focused on becoming the largest agricultural producer in the world. They began producing an abundance of a wide variety of food while having a near monopoly on the production of salt. This allowed China's population to increase from 150 million to over 400 million within 1 century. And because of this, by 1820, 1/3 of the world lived within China's borders. But the Chinese empire eventually began to crumble. As the rest of the world was focusing on a new economy, new technologies, and globalization, China was still focused on agriculture, commodities, and domestic trade. And this came to a head in 1840 when new steam-powered British ships arrived at the coast of China. This was the start of the Opium War, where 20,000 British troops with advanced technology faced off against 100,000 Chinese troops. The war ended up lasting about 3 years, and this was the beginning of the end of the glorious Chinese Empire. After the war, China was forced to give up key ports and cities around the country to the newly advanced Western powers of the world. They were also forced to sign unequal treaties with the West, which crippled the Chinese economy and forced them to pay reparations for the war. This was known as the Century of Humiliation for China, where they went from being the economic powerhouse of the world to an impoverished country that gave up substantial territory to Britain, Russia, Germany, and Japan. Now, by 1920, China was seeking some assistance in order to help the country rebound from its humiliation. So it sought out the help of Vladimir Lenin and the Soviet Union. And over the next several decades, wars, Soviet influence, several power vacuums, and a new leader named Chairman Mao led China towards a new form of economic policy called communism. And up until 1978, communism remained as the main economic model of China. But the government realized that this was not working. In 1978, the GDP per capita of China was a mere $156 US, and the overall Chinese economy had a small growth rate of 2.9%. This meant that the average person in China was living in extreme poverty, and the future didn't look so bright for the Chinese economy. So the country decided to try a new or old system, something that they hadn't tried in nearly 100 years since the days of their global domination. That system was capitalism. But China didn't want to go full capitalism right away. They started off by decollectivizing the agricultural sector, then they began opening themselves up slowly to foreign investors, and eventually granted a few cities the permission to allow private small businesses. However, in 1980, the vast majority of the Chinese economy was still run by the state. But after seeing the success of what capitalism and privatization did for them in the first few years of this new economic model, they released the purse strings on the economy and lifted price controls, began deregulating virtually every industry, and allowed nearly any citizen to start their own business if they wanted to. By 2005, private industries accounted for nearly 70% of China's total GDP. And today, China has lifted hundreds of millions of citizens out of poverty with their new economic model. But during all of this time, there was one industry that the Chinese government paid special attention to: manufacturing. You see, China saw a unique opportunity in the early 1980s where they could begin building up a new technological infrastructure with complete control over regulation, laws, and wages. They also saw that they could build up a state-planned business ecosystem where it would be much more efficient to do business. So they thought theoretically they could have all of the suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, government agencies, and customers all within the same location. So that's what happened. China opened up certain special economic zones like a small town called Shenzhen. Shenzhen had a population of 50,000 people in 1980 before it began attracting investors and turning into the technological hub of the world. Over the next few decades, Shenzhen's population grew to over 12 million people and attracted global business because it was substantially cheaper to manufacture a product in a place like Shenzhen and ship it overseas than it was to pay for manufacturing anywhere in the Western world. And this trend caught like wildfire. Giant companies like Apple, AT&T, GE, Crest, Duracell, Tide, Nike, and virtually every other name brand company in any sector of the Western world began moving their manufacturing over to China. And can you blame them? I mean, this allowed some companies to double their profit margins or allowed some companies to reduce the price of their product for the consumers. It soon became a fact that if you did not manufacture your product in China, then you were not going to have comparable prices to your competitors who did move their manufacturing over to China. So, this is how China became the supply chain of the world. Your options were either move your manufacturing over to China and be competitive, or go out of business. By 2010, China overtook the USA in terms of total manufacturing output, and as of 2020, China controls nearly 30% of the world's manufacturing, meaning that about 1/3 of the world is made in China. Now that I have given you the backstory on China and the Chinese economy, you can likely see the glaring hole in terms of the world putting all of its manufacturing eggs into China's basket. And obviously that is, what if something happened to China? Would 30% of the world just not get their products? And as we learned recently, that answer is kind of yes. The coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan caused virtually an entire shutdown of China's manufacturing sector for several weeks in order to hopefully contain the virus and prevent it from spreading through the population. But because of this, many countries throughout the world are facing shortages of pretty much, well, everything. For example, Apple has a shortage of replacement iPhones. The FDA recently announced an incoming drug and medication shortage. Healthcare facilities have been running out of protective masks. Virtually every clothing company in the Western world has massive delays. And it was even trending on Twitter about how there was going to be a toilet paper shortage around the world. Except that last one isn't true because toilet paper is actually manufactured in many countries throughout the world. So no need to worry about that for the most part. So what effect have these shortages had on the global economy? Well, so far, here's what we know. The coronavirus supply chain slowdown was one of the key factors as to why the stock market has dropped by 11% in the last 3 weeks. Now, many people say that this was just a normal correction that was going to happen anyways, because the stock market has been pretty insane for the past 3 years or so. So we don't know for sure if the coronavirus was the last straw for this stock market correction, or if the coronavirus was actually the driving factor because people are predicting a slowdown in economic growth. Now, we have also seen a sharp decline in travel throughout the world. In fact, travel has decreased by on average about 50% globally in the past 2 months. This has actually forced some flights to fly to their destination with no one on board except for the flight crew. And lastly, this has obviously had a significant impact on China. I mean, China was already having its worst economic growth year in decades before this outbreak occurred. And now that its economic core has been shaken up and forced to temporarily shut down, we might see China having one of its worst overall economic years since it was under a communist economy. Now, there are several other things relating to the coronavirus that I talked about in my other video called The Truth About the Coronavirus. And in that video, I cover whether we should actually be worrying about the disease, I cover a bunch of the actual statistics about it, and I compare the coronavirus to other diseases that are quite similar. So if you want to know more, please check out that video. I also have a game coming out soon called Ethos: The Odyssey. It's a 3D strategy card game where you go to ancient lands and battle historical and mythological figures. So if you are interested in that, I will leave a link to my gaming channel and my Discord down below. And for now, please subscribe and click on my documentaries playlist because I have a bunch of videos similar to this one, so make sure you click on that video and I will see you in just a few seconds.